Hi, you're with Peter Carr and Sam Higgins on LTV's The Research Channel. Well, it doesn't matter which market we're asked by clients to take a look at or what the question is, it inevitably comes down to a question of, can you give us a list of vendors in this particular space? One of those that is interesting and is quite often a case of all or nothing in terms of, do we do it ourselves or do we get rid of it? And if we do keep it ourselves, we don't have the skills, who do we use? And even if we do want to get rid of all of it, who do we use? One of those areas is application testing.
That's
so
right.
it's one of those fundamentals, one of those core parts of ICT delivery inside large organisations. So Sam, what's the story with app testing?
Yeah, look, application testing is one of those areas that no one really can avoid it. Whether it's kind of infrastructure commissioning, you have to do some testing. Whether it's application development, you have to do some testing. We're increasingly seeing, as people move into their application renewal cycle, that being a barrier. You often find that older applications don't have test plans. There was very few automation tools used with older applications, and so we've even seen some business cases that have struggled because once people costed in the amount of testing required as part of the replacement project, they've gone, well, we're not sure we want to do that. So you're right, one of the things that pops up is, can I get this as a service from somebody else? What's interesting for me is often it's that point problem. So it's some sort of chronic symptom of a bigger issue that people come at the testing problem from. Like I said, it's either they never did test-first programming and never maintained test plans for their old applications in the first place. So that's just a bad practice. And one that can be fixed at any time. If you've got a legacy application, you can change the policy today to make it a requirement that new developers or maintenance changes at least have a test plan written for those or some tests captured.
And this is regardless of whether you're using a traditional waterfall approach to app development, Ruby on Rails, Scrum, whatever it is, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't.
Regardless of your development environment, testing is something that is achievable by every organisation.
And it has been a phase and an activity that is in every single methodology. So why we can continue to kind of push it to the back of the bus, I'm not too sure.
And it's not as if it's been an area that's been behind the covers. I mean, there was some insinuation when the Queensland Health Payroll event was rolling out. What happened to the testing environment? What wasn't all this stuff surfaced over the 6 months, leading up to it and things like that. So these are big enterprise decisions. So for organisations to be saying, no, too expensive, we're not going to test, then the ramifications for them can often be quite significant.
Or we're not going to replace an application because it's too expensive to develop the test plans because we don't have them on the existing application. So okay, so you're going to stick with the legacy application, which doesn't itself have any test plans. So your chance of breaking it when you change it's pretty high.
Yeah. So I'm a customer. Sam, we don't have a test environment, or we've looked at it before, it's been too expensive. Can you please tell me 5 companies I can go and talk to?
That's right, yeah. So some of the organisations that you have to consider here are kind of interesting because on one hand, you can go to systems integrators. Systems integrators as a group of technology vendors tend to have testing practices because they're doing integration as a core business. The other organisations that you'll see kind of getting involved in testing services and testing methodologies are the tool vendors. So, your IBMs, your CompuWares, your Progress Softwares, your Micro Focuses, to a lesser degree, CA Technologies, Red Hat, Microsoft, right? All have application development environments and therefore they have some testing tools.
Or partners.
So that's the other place is that we tend to find people trying to come at the testing problem by going and seeking the technology vendor and a solution that way.
Okay, great. That's given me 6, so I'll just go and talk to them.
No, one more. There's one more you have to think about. The third group are really the testing specialists. And within that group, there's probably 2 sub-vendor groups that you need to think about. There are the people whose job it is to train your testing staff. So if you're going to use an internal staff strategy, test and enable your internal staff with the professional skills to do testing well, despite what people think testing is actually quite a complicated profession. I would argue that a good tester is worth, dollars per hour as much as a senior BA. If you can get a really good tester who knows their processes, knows their stuff and knows good tools, they are worth their weight in gold. Because let's face it, they're the ones that are going to save you bacon when the project goes pear-shaped, right? They're the ones that are going to, at the 11th hour, say, yes, you can release it, but understand these are the risks, right? Your BA is going to define what's needed at the front. It's the tester that's going to check whether that was actually delivered. So, important. The second sub-segment in those testing specialists then are actually testing outsourcing organisations. So organisations who are effectively like a component of a systems integrator who can unplug themselves and basically offer pure testing services. The risk in that group that you have to keep in mind is if you're after an agile approach or a test-first type approach, which we would recommend organisations use, then plugging a services company in to do testing at the end is kind of risky because chances are that they're not going to be across the entire requirements continuum from requirements elicitation through design through to delivery. And so there's a risk that they can only test off what it is that they can see. So that's something to keep in mind, that again, testing isn't something to leave at the end. So if you are going to use a testing specialist, they're probably actually going to want to be engaged at the same time as your business analysts. Yeah, start at the front. So
okay, yeah. So an example of a couple of things. I mean, you gave us some broad examples of the technology vendors that might do it, and I'm assuming if I wanted an app testing specialist, I could go to any number of recruiters and give them a spec for that. But
in terms of a tester, in terms of contingent labour testing, that's the other thing, I suppose. Testing also does tend to be put in the contingent labour bucket a lot because it's seen as this temporary thing, right? It's also one of those classic workloads that people talk about for cloud, right? A testing environment, I need to stand it up for a short period of time and then I can bring it back down. So you're right, it's often viewed in that. But if we get past the testing, contingent labour test people, some of the vendors locally in the Australian market that are out there that we've come across in our client engagements and just generally in the market, people like Access Testing. You get into KJ Ross and Associates, another fairly larger testing organisation. Plan IT is another testing specialist. Revolution IT. Then you probably start, once you get out of those guys, bleeding into a hybrid application lifecycle management apps dev process specialists, who then obviously, because they're dealing with the software development lifecycle, have an appreciation for the criticality of testing.
And the ALM probably goes back to being more the channel partners of some of those original vendors you were talking about.
Exactly. And so a classic example there is Redify, Microsoft, big Microsoft partner. They certainly have an SI and process specialist capability. They're an organisation that can help enable organisations around testing activity. You get into people like Enhance ALM here in Brisbane. I think they've also got a Sydney office from memory. Again, a process specialist in application lifecycle management, but with a good, solid appreciation of how testing fits within that lifecycle.
So is that part of the decision then, whether I look to a particular testing specialist who's probably not going to try to sell me anything beyond improving some of our testing capability, as opposed to going with a more ALM focused service provider who may take us on a longer maturity journey if we're looking to improve that part of our business? Yeah,
and that is really important. We've actually got some research on that that I found really useful, because what's interesting is in our 2010-11 ICT spending and priority study, we actually found that 49% of Australia's large enterprises actually have a formalised application development function. So nearly 1 in 2 large enterprises are doing application development.
We're the Bunnings nation.
That's it, yeah, DIY, that's right, down to Bunnings on Saturday and into the office to cut some code on a Monday.
Yeah.
But the other thing that we found is that improving that practice, improving application lifecycle management, was actually a priority for only 23% of senior executives. And in terms of a ranking for funding, it was actually improving application development in terms of speed and quality was actually ranked last out of a set of 12 options for driving IT spending.
Because it's seen as an additional cost to these project quotes that get spat out by the app dev division.
Yep, that's right. But but then 1 in 2 are doing it. So what that suggests is that it's not being while everyone is doing it, they're not investing in it. It's not being done very well, and so you do have to wonder whether engaging just a testing specialist who isn't going to be able to solve that bigger issue of, well, hang on, you're plugging me in at the end, but you actually need to plug some of my specialist capability in at the start of the project. They're not going to get the benefit of a testing specialist unless they've got pretty confident they've got a good application development lifecycle or ALM processes in place.
And with those sort of numbers too, I mean, it would say to me that there's probably some level of expectation by the business owner who's having a process or an application to support that process developed, that testing is a core part of the development process. What we're actually saying and seeing is that it's not. And so that expectation gap between the business owners and the technology doers, builders, providers, is probably quite big in this space. So business executives testing is not a standard offering. It's a tick the box if you want it.
Well, it does seem that way from the data. You're right. The other concern, I suppose, or the other thing that the IT organisation itself has to appreciate is that if 1 in 2 of them are building their own software, they're now effectively competing with software as a service providers who live or die by the quality of their software. I mean, let's face it, if you're paying per month for CRM solutions and the thing goes down, or you put data in it and it breaks, or it's buggy, you'll just pick up your $30 a month per person and go somewhere else. You're going to find a better service because it's all about service, which is always all about quality. And so it is really important that people understand that if they don't improve testing and don't try and deal with some of this application lifecycle management issues, that the gap between what they're providing and what the business can buy direct from a software as a service vendor, as an example, is just going to get wider and wider and wider.
Yeah, it's interesting. Here's a little adjacent thought maybe to finish up on, that the level of commercialisation activity we've seen from applications being spun out of a corporate environment or a government environment logically would have to decrease from this point forward, because they won't be able to compete with the commercial as a service vendors that are in the business of doing exactly that.
And that's a really interesting thought, because if I cast my mind back to like the late 90s, engagements and questions and activities in the application development space that involved exactly that involved questions of spinning IP out of government, for example, of government offering up under a tender process their IP, and even the pressure that we've seen from AIIA and others on the federal government to kind of allow IP to vest with the companies that are creating it.
Recent stoush between the AIIA and Gartner on that point.
On that very topic is interesting, because if you look at it in reality, in the last few years, we've seen very little of that IP spin out. And maybe you're right, maybe that is actually a demonstration of that increasing gap, that really the quality of intellectual property that organisations are capable of delivering in-house at the moment has really dropped off in the face of what you could get potentially outside. In terms of just some other vendors to keep in mind, we've talked about the specialists. If people are looking for a broader service in terms of plugging in application lifecycle management skills into their organisation, then the other ones that we often see who have reasonable practices within country, Capgemini, big global practice in application testing. They certainly have experts in region in that space, both in terms of process and delivery of testing. Fujitsu is another one. Organisations often will engage a Fujitsu for that. Clearly, some of the larger service providers, Indian service providers, for example, will often offer a testing service, but they will typically do that on the basis of a labour arbitrage. So it's very much that kind of narrow, just plug us in, it's a labour, it's a cost thing. So their market strategy is really to try and drive out that cost element that might make people shrink back from a redevelopment, because testing is an expensive exercise. Also
a follow the sun speeding a project delivery.
That's right, yeah, you can do that. A couple other companies just to mention, I suppose, on the list worth having a chat to. SMS Management Technology, they've done some acquisitions, gobbled up some application development practices. Out of that, they've now got a critical mass of people who are capable of doing testing and are reasonably au fait with that part of the life cycle. ThoughtWorks is another one. You'd put them in the same bucket as a Redify, right, or an Enhanced ALM. Good application development people, understand agile development, understand how that gets done, and understand the role of test-first programming. So some of those considerations. So there's a few vendors in the testing space and some things to think about as you look at maybe your next application renewal.
Some great hooks there. Thanks, Sam.
No worries.
One of those areas is application testing.
That's right.
So it's one of those fundamentals, one of those core parts of ICT delivery inside large organisations. So Sam, what's the story with app testing?
Yeah, look, application testing is one of those areas.
Give us a list of vendors in this particular space. One of those that is interesting and is quite often a case of all or nothing in terms of, do we do it ourselves or do we get rid of it? And if we do keep it ourselves, we don't have the skills, who do we use? And even if we do want to get rid of all of it, who do we use?
That no one really can avoid it, whether it's kind of infrastructure commissioning, you have to do some testing, whether it's application development, you have to do some testing. We're increasingly seeing, as people move into their application renewal cycle, that being a barrier. You often find that older applications don't.
Hi, you're with Peter Carr and Sam Higgins on LTV's The Research Channel. Well, it doesn't matter which market we're asked by clients to take a look at or what the question is, it inevitably comes down to a question of